Welcome back everyone. As you can see, I've got the brand new C8 RS6 in front of me. So we had a lot of popularity and success with the C7 system. Also we did the big RS3 system, so this was naturally the next one to do in line. It was a bit tricky to get hold of one in the UK, but thankfully Alex from QS Tuning let us borrow his car for development. So what we're going to do in this video is look at the stock system as it is in the engine bay. I'll remove it, we'll have a look at the internals of it, see where the restrictions lie. I'll then scan the engine bay ready for the development of the design. We'll do some CAD work. Finally, we'll print the prototypes and then we'll test fit them. So first things first, let's open the bonnet and have a look at the stock system. Okay, so here it is. It's a very different layout to the previous generation RS6. In the previous one, the intake was on this side and you had the turbos feeding from pretty much the top of the engine. So it's completely different, totally changed and much more restricted, it seems. I'm going to remove the engine cover. You can have a better look. All right, so clearly you've got the two turbos sitting right at the front of the engine at the top. You've got the two turbo inlets, which straight away look like they're quite small, and depending on how thick that material is, we'll measure exactly how small they are inside, but that looks like a restriction straight away. Those are then connected to these flexible EPDM probably hoses, which is then connected to the lid of the airbox. Looks like there's going to be a panel filter in there and then some sort of lower airbox configuration underneath that with the slam panel from the top, and obviously it's feeding from these openings in the grille which aren't huge. There's only a couple of small gaps which I can see behind that grille. So that's the general layout. Not much more we can really say apart from it does look quite like a compact system, not a lot of room to play with. Let's remove this, have a look at what's underneath that lid and just have a look at the lower airbox and see how much volume there actually is in there. So let's get started with the removal. Okay, I've removed the lid of the airbox. I've also removed the two inlets to the turbos. You can see now the actual impellers of the turbos. And then you can also now see obviously the standard panel paper filter. If I remove this, you can see the base of that airbox now. And it is quite shallow. I was hoping there'd be a bit more depth, but now that we've removed everything, you can see how shallow this is. Doesn't leave a lot of room for breathing, and if we have a look at the base of this filter, you can see the impression lines here, which are from these ridges in the airbox, suggesting that this sits quite far down in that airbox. I'm gonna measure the depth of this. Okay, so from where it sits on the airbox, let's find a better place. Okay, that's 30 millimeters in depth. So where does that sit? Right, so it's there. So that's how far down the filter sits in the airbox. So that leaves us, I'll go down 10 millimeters. So the gap underneath the stock filter to the base of that airbox is only 10 millimeters at the back of the airbox, which is very, very small. I mean, we can obviously see now the openings in the airbox. It's just open at the front. So it's breathing from these two sections at the front of the airbox, which doesn't actually extend all the way across. It's just the sides. And they themselves are quite small as well. So this configuration and design is quite restrictive. You've only got 10 millimeters of space underneath that filter to the base of the airbox, and then you've only got these two small openings at the front, which then breathe from this slam panel, which shapes the flow. So you can see that I can feel the back of this slam panel, which is not connected to this airbox. So they're two separate panels. So it's actually breathing from behind this area. So it's having to make quite a sharp turn downwards to behind the grille area. Well, I think it's quite clear that before we do anything, I think the base of this airbox would have to be redesigned. We need to try and change the configuration of the filter to the airbox and try and get a bit of a better angle, because at the moment you've got airflow coming into the airbox at a 90-degree angle, having to go straight up through that panel filter and then again 90 degrees out to the turbos. Let's see if we can try and change that angle a bit more so it's a bit more direct to the turbos. I mean, there's not a lot of space to work with because obviously we have to take into account the underside of the bonnet or the hood, but we'll come to that when we scan it. I think what I'll do now is we'll remove this slam panel so we can see exactly the entirety of that airbox, the lower section, and how it breathes. Right, I've removed the slam panel cover, which is a separate panel to the airbox itself. You can now see the openings in the airbox. So the filter is actually breathing from these two openings at the front. They then have to negotiate the underside of that. So it's actually coming up through this section here. So that's quite a sharp bend. So it's quite restricted between where that sort of slam panel finishes and where that airbox opens. So yeah, basically that configuration is quite restrictive. Even if we use a thinner filter in there, the angle between the filter and the inlets and then the volume available in that lower section is quite small. Also, the openings are quite restrictive as well. Even though you've got a relatively long filter, you've only got two small openings at the front. So we'll see what we can do about that. Let's now have a look at the upper part of the airbox, the upper section, and also the turbo inlets. Right, so in front of me I've got the lid of the airbox, the two connectors, and the two turbo inlets. Let's have a look at the lid first. I'm going to just lift it off the filter. Okay, straight away you should be able to notice that is a very shallow depth on that lid. It curves downwards quite significantly, and that's probably because it's very close to the bonnet. Not a lot of space there at all. If I turn this around, you can see the actual inlets themselves. Again, they look very small. If you think about the size of this engine and the horsepower it's making, the demand from those turbos, trying to suck through those two small openings, that's a restriction straight away. Let's flip this over. There you can see it's very shallow indeed. That ridge around that airbox is where the filter will sit, which leaves very little room between the top of that filter and the underside of the lid. If I put the filter in place, okay, now you should be able to see, the filter itself now, very, very close to the openings and to the underside of that lid. Now, the other problem I can see straight away with this lid is the shape of it. It's very cuboid in nature, which means you're going to get a lot of dead spaces and vortices. In particular, this area here, being that it's in line with the opening itself, although this is actually the highest point of the airbox, it's actually going to be a dead space because the airflow is going to be pulled through these openings. So that's behind that sort of natural path of least resistance. So you're going to get a lot of dead space in these areas. Also, this middle section, same problem. Your inlets are pulling from this direction, effectively making this section pretty much useless. You're going to get a lot of dead space and vortices around here. So effectively, the parts of this airbox which are going to be in use mostly are these areas, which are the shallowest. These are the connectors between the lid and the turbo inlets. They are here to provide some flexibility so that when the engine moves, these will take some of that flex. Although they are quite rigid, there isn't a lot of movement in them at all. I guess it's just enough to allow that small bit of movement. Now, if you've been watching our videos, you'll know that I have a bugbear with these very rigid connections that OEMs use, and there's a good reason for that. Is if you look inside, probably from that side, you'll see the ridges are very pronounced in there, and the problem is that this connector, where those ridges are, it's changing shape. If this was a straight section with those ridges, it wouldn't be so much of a problem, but the fact that this is changing shape quite significantly as well, you've got an oval here to the connector, to the airbox lid, to a circular opening which is for the turbo inlet. That change of shape is happening across this ridged area, so the airflow is having to negotiate not only that change of shape but also those ridges at the same time. So it's hitting multiple ridges as it's moving. If you can see, let's have a look at this one's more pronounced. This one has, look at that change of shape. That's awful. That is really terrible. You can see how it's moving so dramatically in terms of that change of angle. And if you look inside, you can see, I'm hoping you can see, there's a lot of ridges there, not a lot of clean space for air to travel through to make that transverse from the lid to the turbo inlet. These need to be changed straight away, obviously, with a new airbox lid design. Okay, let's move on to the turbo inlets themselves. The stock turbo inlets are made from cast aluminium, and you can see on the connection to the turbo, you've got these inserts which are plastic. Let me remove one of these. So both inlets have these, and they are flow guides. So these are actually trying to smoothen out the airflow before they hit the turbos. And that's probably because of the tortuous journey they have to make through these connectors and obviously the cuboid airbox lid. So these flow guides are helping to smooth out the airflow before they reach the turbo impellers themselves. Now that in itself is taking away from some of the volume in the turbo inlet. So these are creating a bit of a restriction, but they're necessary because of what's happening in here. We probably won't need these because we're going to make sure the flow is smooth going through the whole track. All right, let's have a look at the general size of these inlets. So on the back end, obviously we've got those flow vanes which go in there, but the internal diameter is what matches up to the turbo itself, which is important because you want to maintain that matched diameter. You don't want to have any exposed walls in front of the turbo. However, it seems like that diameter is pretty constant throughout that inlet. So all the way from the opening to the exit, it's the same diameter, which is quite small. They haven't opened these up at all. So that in itself is a restriction. I mean, since it's the first thing the turbo sees, it's going to create a restriction. So what we'll have to do is, after we've scanned the engine bay, we'll have to have a look and see how much space we've got to try and open these up. But at the same time, keep the back, so where it mates to the turbo, keep that diameter the same. We'll do that next. So I'm going to now go back to the engine bay, scan everything. We'll then take the files up to my computer, we'll look at the scans and then see how much space we've got to design in. Okay, so we're in the office now and I've got the complete scan data on my screen. I have scanned, obviously, everything which you can see, and this is the assembly of all the parts stitched together. So we've got the slam panel area, the airbox itself, which is just a lid, the two turbo inlets and the engine cover. I'll just spin this around so you can get a better idea of everything that's been scanned. So you can see underneath the airbox all the detail which I'm going to need for the design. If I remove some of these components, you'll get a better idea of what's actually underneath. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to show you the clearance between this stock airbox and how tight it already is against the underside of the bonnet or the hood if you're American. That's half of the section of that hood, so you can see underneath. Right, so you can see it's already pretty close to that hood, so we really don't have much room for improvement. There is some room there around this area and then towards the front here, which obviously we're going to use, especially this section here between the top of the stock airbox and that slam panel, which is separate from the stock airbox, but we're going to integrate them so that we can make use of that section of unused volume underneath the hood. Right, let me remove that and start taking away some components. So you can see now these two cables are for the pull for the hood, and then you've got the radiator underneath there, and then this opening right here is where the airbox is actually breathing from. Okay, those are your two turbo inlets, which are actually quite small, and there is some space around those inlets to make them bigger. Finally, I'll remove the inlets, and those are the turbos themselves. You can't see the actual turbines, but those are the actual mounts on which the inlet's secure to. Right, so that's the scan data in full, and we have over the last few months used that to design the intake system. The intake system is done, and I'm now going to show you piece by piece what it looks like in my screen and on the scan data, and I'll compare it with the stock system so you can get a better idea of what we did and why we did it. Okay, so this is now, I'm going to show you the first iteration of the final design, which we then use to go into testing with. So I'm going to start with the actual turbo inlets themselves as the starting point of this entire design, because from that then we can go into the base of the airbox system and then the connecting lid to complete and marry up the whole system. So starting with the left side inlet, if I can find there is, okay, right, that is our enlarged inlet. Now if I can show you, so you can see obviously first off it's very, very tight against the ancillaries around it, but there is some movement in those ancillaries and it's enough space for us to install it, and then also have some silicon couplers on there to connect to the airbox. I'm going to try and, actually let me bring up the right side as well now. Okay, so those are the two inlets. The right side is a bit more complicated because it's got this breather attachment, as well as the secondary breather on this side. Both inlets have been increased in size to as much as possible. That small cutout you can see the inside is to allow for a machined stainless steel ring to be pressed in so that there's some strength around these two areas where the clamps will be. I'm going to bring the stock inlets up so you can get an idea of the difference in size. There you go. Right, so the grey or creamy sort of colour scans are the stock inlets, and obviously the gold colour designs are our new design inlets, and you can see there's a stark difference in diameter between the two. The inlets that we've designed smoothly taper down to match the turbos on the turbo side, which allows for a nice smooth transition as well as opening them up. So as you can see there, that's a very nice illustration of the difference between stock and our inlets. The base of the airbox was a very complicated part to design because we integrated this slam panel area, which on the stock airbox is separate to the component which is at the front of the engine bay. The reason to incorporate that slam panel with the base of the airbox was to maximize on the volume available under the hood, and also to allow us to relocate the filter slightly with a slightly different angle. So on the stock airbox, it was very much a 90-degree turn between where the filters sit to where the inlets are. Let me see if I can just illustrate that quickly. Yeah, so that's the stock airbox, and that, I can't click on actually, that panel, that section where those screws are, is where the filter sits. So if you look at that plane where those screws are, it's very much 90 degrees to those inlets. So what we wanted to do was change that and make it less of an abrupt change in angle. So let me get rid of this. Okay, I'll bring up now our new design for the base of the airbox. Bearing in mind there's a lot of detail on the base of the airbox to clear all the ancillaries and the cables underneath. So there you go. That is one piece. It's the base of the airbox where the filter sits in this area, and it's incorporated with that slam panel. So you can see this section, this is curved outwards, which we've done to take advantage of the underside of the hood. If I bring up the mesh of the hood again, you should be able to see what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm going to spin this around to the side. Okay, now you can see there, this section is where we've increased the size of that airbox, and it's not touching the hood. Obviously you can't touch the hood, there's enough clearance, but it's a lot closer now than the stock airbox was. The stock airbox literally came down at 90 degrees and then across to this flat slam panel area. Also notice now that the angle is a lot less. So the angle previously with the stock airbox, it was actually flat here and it was a 90-degree turn to the inlets. Now you can see the angle is much more improved, so the filters are pointing more towards those inlets, so the filter will sit on top of this airbox. Right, the final piece of the puzzle, actually let me show you this. You can see the detail on the inside here. See those ribs? Those are to allow for the cables underneath, and there are other details, and actually very importantly underneath the airbox is the opening to where it breathes from. So on the stock airbox, the opening was literally two slits behind this area. On our airbox it's open all the way across, so we've maximized on that opening above the radiator. So instead of breathing through from two small slits, as we showed you downstairs when I was showing you the actual stock airbox, this is how it's breathing now, it's from that whole section. Right, so we designed 4 different lids, and the only way to really come down to the final solution is for testing, which we'll do later. So let me just show you the lids which were designed. So starting with this one. So this is the first one. This one was designed by maximizing on all the potential space underneath the hood. So you can see it's quite cuboid in nature, similar to the stock one, but we've separated the two flow channels for the two different turbos. They're not joined. It's maximized in terms of volume, so it's very close to the underside of the hood, but still allowing for adequate clearance. That's one design. Also, sorry to mention, the openings of this lid is a lot bigger than the stock Airbox opening was. Okay, so that's one. I'm just going to get that at an angle for you. Okay, that's one. The second variation was the same as this, so maximum possible volume under the hood, but then we joined both of those sections so that there's no separate channel for each turbo, which again obviously increases the total volume of the lid of the Airbox, but we're not sure if there's any detrimental effect of combining the flow volume for both turbos. Obviously, if you can think of the turbos pulling individually at the same time, they will be competing in that space. So not sure yet if that's going to create any issues. Obviously the stock one is joined, but we want to see if there's any advantage of separating them or not. So the second version is this one. Okay, let's remove the first one. Okay, so there you can see that middle section now is joined. So the rest of the lid is the same, maximum volume, but the middle section is now joined. So you've got one complete opening for the engine and the two turbos to breathe from. Right. Moving on from this one, the next two lids take on a different design philosophy. So whereas these ones were designed with maximum volume in mind, the next lid was designed with flow in mind. So trying to maximize on the volume, but giving more precedence to the actual shape of the flow. So let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to just remove that. So remember that was a bit sort of cuboid in nature. This one, so very different shape, and this one has been designed for flow. So to try and improve as much as possible on the shape of the flow, to reduce stagnation points, to reduce voids in the airbox and turbulence. Whereas the previous one was just as much volume as possible, cuboid in nature. You would have areas where the corners were, where you'd get natural turbulence and sort of voids. With this one, it's a lot more organically shaped. So you can see from a side profile, it's a lot more organic. You've got much smoother profile going from where that filter, the top of the filter would sit, to those inlets. There isn't much volume behind this area, because if the turbo's drawing air in from this sort of direction, you don't want to have too much area behind that opening, because you're going to get a natural area of turbulence there. So this lid has been designed very much for volume. The final lid is the same philosophy as this, but we've separated the flow channel. So where you've got a connection between the lids here, the two flow volumes. Okay, last one is separate channels for both of those turbos. Now, in my kind of experience, my feelings are that the latter two designs, which are designed for flow over total volume, should, in theory, be better than the ones which are designed for purely volume and a bit more cuboid, like the stock Airbox. But we will find out when these are tested, which will be later on. So that's the complete system. The only thing left is some brackets which we've done to secure the Airbox down. the filter itself, obviously, which is internal, and then the two silicon joiners. I'll just show you those. Remove those. Bring this one back up. Okay, and the silicon couplers to connect the lid to the inlets. I'll just bring one up. There's no point bringing them to you. I can show you. So that's a silicon coupler. It connects the inlet to the airbox lid, and crucially, the inside of that coupler has a step right there which marries up to the wall of that inlet. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to try and just section this to illustrate what I mean. Just do it there. Okay. Right. I've just cut this across the top so you can see inside, and if you look there, so that silicon, that's the inside wall of the silicon, and right there there's a step. So what that does is it mates on to the inside or the outside wall of this inlet, and it matches the diameter of the inside diameter of this inlet. So when airflow is going through this silicon, it doesn't see any exposed wall before it enters the turbo inlet, which is very important, because when you're so close to the turbo and you've got so much velocity going through that section, if you see an exposed wall, so if you put, let's say you put a silicon coupler without that step, that silicon coupler will go on the outside of the inlet, which will expose the thickness of that inlet. So the airflow will see that thickness and hit that sort of inside wall before it enters the inlet, and then you get a lot of turbulence there. So this removes that by keeping the flow channel really smooth all the way through from the airbox to the silicon to the inlet. The final thing is the filter itself, which, as you may or may not know by now, BMC are collaborating with us to make a custom filter for this airbox. So that's underway. I'm going to now just remove this model and just show you the filter with the airbox in place. In this model, I've got the assembly of the lower and upper airbox with the filter inside, which is, as I mentioned, made by BMC. So that's the filter. It's a cotton mesh filter as BMC make, with a rubber surround. It's obviously, we've made it as large as we possibly can to fit inside the airbox. The airbox, again, as we mentioned previously, was made for maximum volume, so I couldn't actually physically make that filter any bigger. If I did, the airbox would start to foul on the underside of the hood. So in terms of pure surface area, this filter is, I'd say, marginally bigger than the stock one, and that's purely down to the fact that the restriction of space under the hood. But what we have done is we've improved on the shape and the flow shape, where the angle of the filter and how the flow goes through the filter and into the inlet. So that's what the advantage is. If I just do a cross section from the side, so you can kind of visualize where how the flow goes through the system. So I've just cut away a section of the assembly, and you can see now how the filter sits, how far it goes down, and the opening. So obviously your airflow goes up through this opening, through this section, and then up through the filter, and then through the lid. So the filter comes down as far as that change of angle on the lower airbox. We've tried to, I could have made the filter deeper, but then you'd be restricting on the space underneath the filter for where it's drawing air in from. On the stock airbox and the stock filter, it's quite shallow. The airbox is quite shallow, so the filter does sit very close to the base of the airbox, as we showed you with those measurements. So we've managed to lift that up a bit and have a bit more space under the filter to draw air in from. Okay, that's pretty much it for the filter and airbox combination. The final thing I'm going to show you is just a comparison between our assembly, our design, and stock airbox in situ in the engine bay overlapped. So you can sort of see where we've increased volumes and areas. Okay. So that's our airbox. I'm going to bring up the stock airbox back now. Right, that's the stock airbox lid. And if I bring the stock panel back, you probably won't be able to see it because it's so shallow, it's hiding underneath. Yeah, so you won't really see much there. But anyway, let's look at the lid first. Just move this away. Okay. You can see now where we've maximized or increased the volume of our lid as opposed to the stock airbox lid. So where our lid is sort of protruding away from that scan is where we've improved it. So it's quite a big difference at the front, right there, where the stock airbox curves upwards from that shape. Our one moves up straight away and then smoothly goes towards the inlets. So there's quite a big change, and that angle I was talking about previously is now much more apparent here. So those two screws, one there and one there, that's the plane of where the stock filter sits. So if you imagine the stock filter is, the top of the stock filter is parallel to that face, on our airbox it's at a much less of a steep angle as compared to those inlets. I hope that's clear. It should be clear on your screen. So I'll just show you again. This plane here, this section which I've highlighted right now, that's where our filter sits. Compare that angle now with the angle of where the stock filter sits in the stock airbox. So if that's the stock airbox, that's our airbox. So your inlets are here. Our airbox has a much more direct path to the inlets as compared to the stock airbox. It's a 90-degree abrupt change in angle to the inlets. Right. Oh, I know this is, I was supposed to be saying the final thing, but I promise this is the final thing. Let me just look at the lower part of the airbox. I'm going to make that see-through so you can see the stock panel underneath. I'm going to change that material. Okay. So that's now see-through. You can see, hopefully, how much of a difference there is between our slam panel airbox integration to the stock slam panel. So there's a stock slam panel that goes down and across. Our one rises up straight away and then smoothly goes across to the lid. So as you can see, we have absolutely maximized wherever we can, both in terms of volume and flow. So that's it in terms of the design. Now we're going to start printing these parts and get ready for testing. So we just looked at the design in CAD. Now I've been made aware that I've gone on for far too long. I've got a bit carried away with my explanations. So this video's got just a bit too long now for us to now go into the prototypes. So what we're going to do is end this video here, and then in the next video we're going to look at the prototypes and compare the actual printed prototypes with the stock airbox, and then we can then reflect back to what we've seen with CAD. So I'll end this now, and hopefully we'll see you next time for the prototypes.
Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you liked the video, please give us a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please remember to subscribe to the channel and turn your notifications on. If you want to join the conversation, please drop us a comment below and we will do our best to respond to you. And if you're running out of things to watch, why don't you watch one of these two?